Sterling Voss, leaned across the mercantile counter and said it loud enough for everyone to hear. Somebody ought to tell the widow Ashcombe that a veil isn't thick enough to hide ugly. The men nearby laughed. A woman pretended to study bolts of fabric. The shopkeeper kept his eyes on his ledger. Nobody said a word. Lenora Ashcombe stood 12 feet away holding a list of supplies, her back straight, her left hand gripping the paper hard enough to wrinkle it. The scar ran from her temple across her cheekbone, permanent, visible, undeniable. She had learned not to flinch when people said things like that. She had learned not to give them the satisfaction. But today, something unexpected happened. A child's voice cut clean across the room. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself." Everyone turned. 8-year-old Maisie Rourke stood in the middle of the mercantile floor, boots dusty, chin up, staring at Sterling Voss like he was something unpleasant she'd stepped in. If you've ever felt judged for something you couldn't change, if you've ever watched someone be cruel and wished someone would stand up and say enough, stay with this story until the very end. Subscribe to our channel so you never miss the stories that matter. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us the city and country where you're watching from. We love knowing how far these stories travel. Now, let's go back to Copper Hollow, Montana, 1887, and meet the woman no one believed was worth loving. The morning Lenora Ashcombe arrived in Copper Hollow, it had been raining since before dawn. The stage road into town was a soft disaster of mud and wheel ruts, and by the time the hired carriage rolled past the feed store and the livery and the squat row of buildings that passed for our main street, the horses were blowing hard, and the driver looked like he'd aged 10 years since breakfast. Lenora sat on the right side of the carriage, away from the window, the way she always did in unfamiliar towns. Old habit. If people couldn't see her face clearly through the glass, they couldn't start forming opinions before she'd even stepped down. Not that it helped much. It never really did. She had the letter in her coat pocket, the one from her late husband's solicitor in Helena, and she'd read it enough times that she could have recited it without looking. 7 pages detailing the full extent of what Edmund Ashcombe had left her. Silver Briar Ranch, 9,840 acres in the foothills west of Copper Hollow. Cattle, breeding horses, water rights on 3 seasonal creeks. A main house, 2 bunkhouses, a barn complex that the solicitor had described as substantial, and a bank account in Helena that she wouldn't need to touch for 20 years if she was careful. Edmund had been a careful man, a thoughtful man, a decent man in most of the ways that counted. He had also been dead for 14 months, and Lenora was still learning what that meant. Hour by hour, in the small, unexpected ways a person realizes how thoroughly another person's life was woven into the fabric of their own. Pulled the letter from her pocket and folded it smaller. Put it back. The carriage slowed, and through the rain-streaked window she could see they were passing the mercantile. A group of men stood under the overhang, out front, out of the weather, the kind of men who gather somewhere dry and run their mouths when there's nothing better to do. One of them, big, well-dressed, the kind of man who wore his money in the way he stood, said something that made the others laugh. Lenora didn't hear the words through the glass. She saw the laughter, though. Saw the way 2 of them glanced toward the carriage. She looked away. The carriage stopped at the end of the block in front of Halverson's Mercantile, which was where the solicitor had arranged for her to pick up the ranch's account ledgers from the local man handling the books. She needed those ledgers. She needed to understand what Silver Briar actually was before she could decide what to do with it. The driver climbed down and opened the door, and Lenora stepped out into the fine drizzle with her list already in her hand. She wore a plain gray traveling coat, sensible boots, no jewelry beyond a simple watch on a chain. She had stopped wearing elaborate things after the accident. Elaborate things made people look at you, and when people looked at you, they saw the scar, and when they saw the scar, they either stared or looked away too fast, and neither felt like being treated like a human being. The mercantile was warm and smelled of coffee and fresh-cut wood and tobacco. 3 women stood near the fabric bolts on the left side. A pair of older men occupied the 2 chairs near the cold stove in back. Behind the main counter, a thin man with spectacles and careful hands was sorting mail into a wooden rack. Lenora moved toward the counter. She hadn't taken 4 steps before she heard the bell above the door ring behind her and felt the cold air cup in. As several people entered at once, the men from under the overhang outside, brushing rain from their coats, still talking. She recognized the voice immediately, the one that carried. Copper Hollow's about to have itself a celebrity. A pause for effect. Heard the Ashcombe widow finally came to look at her dead husband's ranch. 7 pages of property and not one good look to show for it. Lenora kept walking toward the counter. Man's been gone 14 months, and I still say he had the harder end of the bargain. The laughter was quieter inside, but it was there. Lenora set her supply list on the counter. The shopkeeper looked up at her and had the grace to look uncomfortable. Behind her, she heard one of the women near the fabric bolts make a small sound that might have been embarrassment, or might have been amusement. It was the kind of sound that could have been either. "I'm looking for Halverson," Lenora said to the shopkeeper. Her voice came out even. She had practiced that over 14 months. "He's holding some ledgers for me." "That's me, ma'am." "Yes, ma'am, I've got those." Halverson moved toward the back without quite meeting her eyes. Behind her, the loud voice again. "Hell of a thing, inheriting all that acreage. Makes a man wonder what a woman like that could possibly need with 9,000 acres. Same thing any man needs with 9,000 acres, someone said. More. Somebody ought to tell her a veil isn't thick enough to hide ugly. The mercantile went quiet in the particular way that spaces go quiet when someone has said something that everyone knows is wrong, but no one wants to be the person who points it out. Lenora did not turn around. Her hand tightened on the edge of the counter, the list paper crumpling slightly under her fingers. She breathed through her nose. She fixed her eyes on the shelf of account books behind Halverson's empty counter position, and she waited. She was very good at waiting. She had gotten good at it the same year. She got good at keeping her voice even. "You ought to be ashamed of yourself." The voice was small and absolutely certain. Lenora turned. A girl stood in the middle of the mercantile floor. 8 years old, maybe 9. Boots so worn the sole of the left one had separated slightly at the toe. A coat that had been mended at both elbows with slightly different brown thread. Dark hair that someone had braided this morning, but which had mostly escaped by now, hanging in pieces around a face that was set in an expression of pure, uncomplicated fury. The girl was looking directly at the man who had spoken, the well-dressed one, Sterling Voss. Lenora would later learn with the kind of moral clarity that children sometimes have before the world teaches them it's dangerous. "My papa says only a man who feels small inside says big loud things to make himself feel better," the girl continued. "You must feel real small." Dead silence. Sterling Voss's face went through several expressions quickly. Surprise, then amusement, then something harder when the other men looked at him. "Little girl," he said, "you might want to mind your business." "This is my business," she said. "Mama always told me cruelty is everybody's business." Voss opened his mouth. The mercantile door opened again, and a man came through it fast, rein on his shoulders, scanning the room the way a person does when they've lost track of a child in a public place and know they're going to find her in the middle of something. He was tall, lean in the way of men who work hard and don't eat enough, with hands that had been outdoors in every weather, and a face that had the kind of quiet in it that comes from a life with more problems than complaints. He took one look at his daughter, standing in the middle of the room facing Sterling Voss, and he crossed the space in 4 strides. "Maisie." His voice was low. "Papa, he said something cruel about that lady and nobody." "I heard." He put his hand on the girl's shoulder. Then he looked at Voss. Something passed across his face. Not quite anger. Quieter than that. "You heard my daughter. She's 8. She managed to figure out the right thing to do. I'd have thought that was in reach for a grown man." Voss's jaw tightened. "Watch your mouth, Rourke. You work for people in this town." "I work for people who pay fair wages for fair work," the man said. "I'm not aware that includes needing to laugh at women to keep the job." He looked at his daughter. "Apologize to Mrs." He stopped. Because he had turned toward Lenora, and for the first time he was actually looking at her. Not at the scar. At her. The distinction was small, and it was everything. "I'm sorry for interrupting your morning," he said. Straight to her, and for whatever was said before we came in. "My daughter has a habit of being right at inconvenient moments." Lenora realized she hadn't said anything in some time. "She was right," she said, "and you didn't need to." Seemed like somebody did. He shrugged, "Just a fraction. Like it wasn't a complicated thing. He looked at his daughter again. Maisie. The girl turned toward Lenora. Up close, she had her father's quiet in her eyes, mixed with something warmer. She offered her hand, very formally, the way someone had taught her. I'm Maisie Rourke. I'm sorry people are unkind. I don't think it should happen. Lenora looked at that small outstretched hand for a moment. Then she shook it. I'm Lenora Ashcombe. Thank you, Maisie Rourke. The girl smiled. It changed her whole face. Are you the lady who owns Silver Briar now? I am. Papa worked there last season. He says the horses there are the best horses he's ever seen. The man her father looked like he might actually be mildly mortified. Maisie, that's not. It's all right, Lenora said. She found, to her own surprise, that she almost meant it. Halverson reappeared from the back with a leather satchel and set it on the counter with visible relief that someone else had managed the situation. Lenora took it, settled the account, and gathered her list. Sterling Voss had gone quiet on the other side of the room. His friends had rearranged themselves slightly, the way men do when they realize the room has shifted and they're no longer the interesting part of it. Lenora pulled on her gloves. She looked once more at the girl, who was watching her with open, uncomplicated interest, the scar visible in her face and absolutely unremarkable to those dark eyes. Children either stared or didn't, and Maisie Rourke, apparently, simply didn't. It was nice to meet you, Lenora said, and meant it more than she'd meant most things in recent memory. Outside, the rain had lightened. She walked to the carriage, ledger satchel under one arm, and climbed up without help. She didn't look back, but she thought, for the rest of the drive out to Silver Briar, about a little girl in mended boots who had stepped into the middle of a room full of adults and decided, without any hesitation, that cruelty was worth fighting. It had been a long time since anyone had decided anything was worth fighting on Lenora's behalf. The ranch road off the main track ran 3 miles through low hills before the Silver Briar property began in earnest. And by the time the carriage reached the main gate, the rain had stopped entirely, and the late afternoon light was coming through the breaks in the cloud cover in long pale slants across the grass. She had expected the ranch to feel like a ledger entry, like a problem to be assessed. Instead, when she stepped out of the carriage in front of the main house and stood looking at the buildings, and the valley running west, and the horses moving in the far pasture, she felt something she hadn't felt in so long she almost didn't recognize it. Space to breathe. The ranch manager, an older man named Gibbons, who had been running the day-to-day operations since Edmund's death, came out to meet her. He was efficient and respectful, and clearly uncertain whether she intended to sell the place immediately, which she supposed was a reasonable concern. I'm not selling, she told him before he could ask. I need to understand the operation first. I'd like to go through the books tonight, and tomorrow you can introduce me to the working hands. Yes, ma'am. He said it with some relief. Is there a Rourke on the roster? Callan Rourke? Gibbons nodded. Seasonal. Works from spring to late fall most years. Good man with horses. Better than most. Is he here now? Left last week, season's end. Comes back come spring, generally. Lenora nodded. She'd already been half telling herself it didn't matter, that she'd asked only because it was efficient to know the hands. She took the ledgers to the main house study and spent 4 hours with them by lamplight. Silver Briar was not in trouble. Edmund had been careful, as always, but it was not growing either. The breeding operation had potential that hadn't been developed. The cattle numbers were stable, but the market for good quarter-horse bloodlines was expanding, and Silver Briar had the stock to capitalize on that expansion if someone with real horse knowledge was managing the breeding program. She made made more notes, ate a cold supper that the housekeeper, a quiet woman named Ruth, left outside the study door. She fell asleep in the chair somewhere around midnight with a pencil still in her hand. She dreamed, briefly and without narrative, about a child's hand reaching up in formal greeting. Winter settled over Copper Hollow in the slow, deliberate way of Montana winters, first the cold, then the gray, then the particular stillness that comes when the world reduces itself to what it absolutely needs to be. Lenora spent those months learning Silver Briar the way she'd learned Edmund's business, systematically, carefully, with the understanding that ignorance was not a virtue. She rode the property in weather that made Gibbons visibly concerned. talked to suppliers and buyers and neighboring ranchers and the men at the bank in Copper Hollow who handled Silver Briar's accounts. She also learned, gradually and without quite intending to, the shape of the town's opinion. Copper Hollow had approximately 460 residents and the social dynamics of a much smaller place. Everybody knew everything. The widow Ashcombe's arrival had been noted, assessed, and filed under interesting development before the end of her first week. The question of what she intended to do with the ranch, whether she'd sell, whether she'd find some man to hand it to, whether she'd run it herself, and how long before she failed was apparently a popular topic at the feed store and the saloon both. Sterling Voss's name came up often. He owned Crescent Creek Ranch, which bordered Silver Briar on the southeast 3,000 acres, good water, a profitable cattle operation. He was 47, twice widowed, and according to every source Lenora consulted, considerably wealthier than his manner suggested, and considerably more complicated than his wealth suggested. He had called on her twice by the end of November, very formally, with business pretexts that barely concealed social ones. Both times she had been courteous and direct and had indicated, as clearly as was possible without being rude, that she was not interested in social calls. The third time he came without pretext. "I'll be plain," he said, sitting across from her in the main house parlor with his hat in his lap and his eyes steady on her. He was a handsome man, in the way of men who have always been told so. Silver Briar and Crescent Creek together would be the largest operation in the county. "The water rights alone," Mr. Voss, Lenora said. "Silver Briar is not for sale. I'm not talking about buying it. I know what you're talking about." She set down her coffee cup. "I inherited this ranch from my husband of 11 years. I am running it myself, and I intend to continue running it myself. I am not looking for a husband or a partner or a buyer. I am looking for a good breeding program manager and a reliable grain supplier." She stood. "If you hear of either of those, I'd be grateful for the information." Voss sat for a moment without speaking. Then he stood very slowly and settled his hat on his head. "You're making this harder than it needs to be," he said. Quiet, not quite a threat, not quite not one either. "Good afternoon, Mr. Voss." He left. Lenora stood at the parlor window and watched his horse move up the drive and thought, that man is not going to let this go. She was right, but she didn't know yet how far he'd take it. Spring came the way spring comes in Montana, not gently, in stages, but in sudden violent lurches of warmth between last-chance snowstorms. The road to the ranch became passable again. The horses moved back to the spring pastures. And the seasonal hands started coming back, one by one, as word went around that Silver Briar was staying open, and the widow Ashcombe, whatever people might say about her, paid on time and didn't cheat a man on his wages. Callan Rourke came back the third week of April. Lenora was in the main barn doing an inventory of the tack room when Gibbons brought him through. "Mrs. Ashcombe, Rourke's back like I said he would be." She looked up from the saddle she'd been examining. Rourke stood a few feet back from Gibbons, hat in his hands, the same worn hat from the mercantile, and for a moment he looked slightly startled, the way people do when they encounter someone outside the context where they first met them. "Mr. Rourke," she said. "Mrs. Ashcombe." He nodded. Something shifted slightly in his face. "I didn't know you were Gibbons," said the new owner would want to meet the hands. "I didn't He stopped. "I'm sorry, I'm making this awkward." "A little," she said. "Not unkindly. But you can settle it by telling me what you actually know about the Silver Briar horses. Honestly, not what you'd tell a new employer who's watching you." He blinked. Then something in him seemed to recalculate. "The breeding program's been coasting," he said. "You've got 3 mares that shouldn't be in the current rotation. They're too old and they're producing weak foals. You've got 1 stallion that every buyer in the territory would pay real money for if he was properly marketed, but nobody's done it. And you've got 2 young horses in the south pasture that aren't in any of your sale records, which means either they were born after the last inventory or somebody's been keeping them off the books." Lenora was quiet for a moment. "The mares," she said. "Which 3?" he told her. She had already had the same suspicion about 2 of them, from the birth records in the ledgers. The third one she hadn't caught. "The stallion," she said. "Raven?" "Yes, ma'am." "And the 2 young horses in the south pasture?" I'd want to look at the South Pasture records before I said anything definitive about those. So would I, she said. Come with me. They spent 2 hours in the South Pasture and then another hour in the records room going through the breeding logs from the past 3 years. Gibbons drifted in and out, useful when referenced, discreet enough not to hover. By the time the light was going in the west window, Lenora had confirmed that the 2 unregistered young horses had been foaled during a period when the previous foreman, a man who'd left suddenly 8 months ago, had been managing the records. Which meant either serious incompetence or something worse. Thank you, she told Rourke. She meant it. You were direct. You asked me to be. Most men aren't, when they think they might be telling an employer something she doesn't want to hear. He picked up his hat from the table. Most men are working up to asking for something when they do that. She looked at him. I'm just here to work with the horses, he said. Even. No performance in it. That's the whole of it. Maisie appeared at Silver Briar for the first time 4 days later. She arrived on a horse that was too big for her, riding competently enough that it was only slightly terrifying, and she appeared at the main house door and asked Ruth the housekeeper very politely whether Mrs. Ashcombe was available and whether she might see the horses. Ruth came to find Lenora in the study. There's a child at the door. Lenora set down her pen. What kind of child? The determined kind. Maisie stood on the front step with her chin up and her braid coming apart again, and the expression of who has thought through several possible objections and prepared responses to all of them. Good morning, Lenora said. Good morning, Mrs. Ashcombe. I came to see if you needed any help. I'm good with horses. Does your father know you're here? A fractional pause that answered the question before the words did. He knows I ride out on Saturdays. That's not what I asked. Maisie shifted slightly. He knows I wanted to visit. Maisie. The girl's shoulders dropped a fraction. He said not to bother you. Ah. Lenora leaned against the doorframe and looked at the child the horse she'd ridden over on, the worn coat, the complete sincerity in her face. Well, since you're already here, she showed her the horses. Maisie moved through the barn with the quiet, careful attention of someone who had been around horses her whole life. She didn't squeal or chatter. She stood at each stall and let the horses smell her hand first. When they reached Raven's stall, she stood for a long time just looking. Papa says he's the best horse in the territory, she said. Your father seems to say that about a lot of things. Maisie looked up at her, completely serious. He doesn't say things he doesn't mean. Lenora believed that, actually. She'd noticed it in 2 days of working beside the man. He spoke when he had something to say. He didn't fill silence with noise. Could I come back? Maisie asked. Sometimes? Lenora considered several practical reasons why that would be complicated. The girl was watching her with the quiet patience of someone who has learned not to push. Yes, Lenora said. Sometimes. What she hadn't anticipated was how much she would come to look forward to those visits. Maisie was sharp. Not in the perform brightness way of children who have been told they're smart, in the actual way, the way that showed up in how she watched things, asked the right questions, noticed what other people missed. Lenora started bringing out books. Maisie consumed them. She had been doing sums since she was 5. Her father had apparently taught her, but she'd never been shown bookkeeping, and she took to it with the concentration of someone learning a language she'd been waiting to find. Why do the columns have to balance? She asked, frowning at the practice ledger Lenora had set up for her. Because if they don't, something's wrong. Money went somewhere it shouldn't have, or someone made an error. Columns tell you when to look harder. Maisie stared at the numbers for a moment. It's like truth-telling, she said, but for numbers. Lenora looked at her. That's exactly what it is. The girl seemed satisfied with that and went back to the sums. Callan Rourke, for his part, said almost nothing about his daughter's visits to the main house. He worked. He was good at it, better than good. Lenora had started to realize that Gibbons was competent, but that Rourke understood horses the way some people understand music, in the bones, in a way that couldn't be fully learned from books or instruction. He'd started suggesting changes to the breeding rotation that aligned with what Lenora had already been thinking, and when she asked him to explain his reasoning, he did so without talking down to her or simplifying anything. She appreciated that more than she'd expected to. One afternoon in late May, she came out to the corral where he was working with one of the young mares, the kind of slow, patient work that takes an hour to look like nothing and 20 years to learn to do correctly, and she stood at the fence and watched for a while without speaking. He knew she was there. He didn't perform for it. He just kept doing what he was doing. "I want to develop the breeding program properly," she said eventually. "I want to market Raven seriously, build out the registration records, approach buyers in Helena and Billings, possibly further." Kept working. "You'd need someone managing it full time. Not just seasonal, I'm aware. Gibbons is a good ranch manager." "He's not a horseman. I know." He was quiet for a moment. The mare moved and he moved with her, easy as water. "You're asking me," he said. "I'm telling you what I need. I'm asking whether you're interested." He stopped, turned to look at her across the top rail of the fence. "I've got 40 acres, he said. "Homestead debt I'm working down. I can't afford to walk away from seasonal work if I'm going to hold on to that land. Permanent position pays more than seasonal." "By how much?" She told him. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he was going to say no. "I'd want it clear," he said finally, "that the position stands on the work." "Not on," he stopped, chose the next words carefully. "Not on anything else." She met his eyes. "It stands on the work," she said. "Those are the only terms I'm offering. Then I'm interested." She nodded, started to turn back toward the house. "Mrs. Ashcombe." She stopped. "What happened at the mercantile?" "Back in November, he was looking at the mare, not at her." "It should have been said sooner by somebody older." "It was said," Lenora answered, "by someone with better instincts than most of the adults in the room." She went back to the house. She could hear him behind her, still working the mare, the quiet creak of the fence post as the animal shifted her weight. She didn't look at her reflection in the hallway mirror when she came inside. She'd stopped doing that as much lately. She wasn't sure exactly when. Callan Rourke was not an easy man to work alongside, and Lenora figured that out within the first 2 weeks of his permanent position. It wasn't that he was difficult, he wasn't. He showed up before anyone else and left after. He didn't complain about weather or workload, or the fact that the south pasture fence needed replacement in 4 separate sections, and it was going to take most of June to do it properly. He didn't ask for things he hadn't earned. He didn't make excuses. What he was honest in a way that occasionally felt like sandpaper. The 3rd week of May, Lenora came out to the main barn with a buyer's letter from a ranch in Billings, a man named Carlisle, who wanted to purchase 2 of Silver Briar's younger mares at a price that was, on the surface, reasonable. She showed Rourke the letter because she decided to let him have a say in which horses left the property, since he'd be the one managing what remained. He read it, handed it back. "Don't sell to Carlisle," he said. "Price is fair. The price is fair because he's planning to resell them at twice that inside 6 months. He's done it with 3 ranches in the last 2 years. You'll see Silver Briar horses in another man's sale catalog with Silver Briar's reputation attached to them and nothing to show for it but what you took in the first sale." Lenora looked at him. "How do you know that?" "Worked for one of those 3 ranches." She wrote back to Carlisle declining. 3 weeks later, she heard through Gibbons, who heard from the feed store, that Carlisle had made almost exactly the kind of deal Rourke had described with a ranch outside of Great Falls. She didn't mention it to Rourke. She didn't need to. But she started listening to him differently after that. Maisie came to Silver Briar twice a week through May and into June. Lenora had stopped pretending the visits were about the horses somewhere around the 3rd week. The girl was good with the horses, genuinely. Not just enthusiastically, but what she really came for was the kitchen table in the main house, where Lenora set out the books and the ledger paper, and they worked through numbers together for an hour before Maisie invariably ended up talking about everything else in her life with the unself-conscious openness of a child who hasn't yet learned to be guarded. She talked about her father a great deal. Not in the way children sometimes do, as complaints or as praise, but in the particular way of someone who has been watching a person closely for a long time and has complicated feelings about what they've seen. "He doesn't sleep enough," she told Lenora one afternoon in June, frowning at a column of figures. "I hear him up in the night. He thinks I don't, but the cabin's small." He works hard, Lenora said, carefully. He's worried about the homestead debt. Maisie moved her pencil to the next column. Better since he started here, but it was bad for a long time. After Mama died, he almost lost it. She said this with the evenness of a child who has processed a hard thing until it became fact. He won't talk about it, but I know. Mrs. Gibbons told me once. She thought I was too young to understand. Were you? I was 6. I understood enough. She added a column and checked it twice. He works so hard, so I'll have something. He thinks I don't know that either. Lenora was quiet for a moment. You know a great deal for 8 years old, she said. Maisie looked up at her directly, the way she did things. Mama said paying attention is the most important thing a person can do. She said most people are too busy waiting for their turn to talk. The afternoon light came through the study window and lay across the table between them. Lenora thought about Edmund, who had also been a man who listened more than he talked, and felt the particular complicated grief of remembering someone in a good moment and not being sure whether it helps or hurts. She was right, Lenora said. Did your husband die too? Yes. Do you miss him? Lenora considered giving the careful adult answer. Then she looked at this child who had just quoted her dead mother's wisdom with complete simplicity. Every day, she said, differently than I used to. But yes. Maisie nodded, like this was information she was filing away in a place she'd come back to. They went back to the ledger. The thing between Lenora and Callan Rourke built slowly and without either of them exactly choosing it. It was in the conversations they had over the horse records, in the evenings when the hands had gone. It was in the argument they had in the second week of June when he told her she was wrong about the eastern pasture rotation, and she told him she had numbers to support her position, and he said sometimes numbers didn't account for what you could see with your eyes, and she said sometimes what you could see with your eyes didn't account for 7 years of rainfall data. They stood in the barn with their voices raised slightly, and neither one of them backed down. Until Gibbons found a reason to be somewhere else. They were both partly right. They agreed on that, eventually, in the particular annoyed way of two people who don't like being told they're not completely right, but can't argue with the evidence. You could have just told me what you were thinking, Lenora said, later. I did tell you, after you'd already made the decision. He was quiet. Then, I'm used to working for people who don't want the real answer. He stopped, something in the set of his jaw. I'm still learning what you actually want. What I actually want, she said, is someone who will tell me when I'm wrong before it becomes a problem. Not after. Even if you push back, especially if I push back. She picked up the report she'd been working on. If you're right, I'll eventually figure it out. If you're wrong, I want to hear your reasoning so we can get there faster. He thought about that for a moment. That's not how most bosses work, he said. I'm aware. I've had most bosses. Something shifted slightly in his face. Not quite a smile. Close to one. It was the first time she'd seen anything close to it, and she went back to her report and refused to think about it. The talk started in town sometime in late June, and by early July, Lenora was hearing it from 3 separate directions. Ruth the housekeeper mentioned it sideways, in the manner of a woman who feels obligated to pass something on and uncomfortable about doing it. Halverson at the Mercantile managed to convey it in approximately 4 sentences while she was signing for a supply order. And then one afternoon, Gibbons sat down across from her in the main house kitchen with his hat in his hands and the look of a man who has been thinking about saying something for a while. There's talk, he said. I know. It's getting louder. I know that too. He turned his hat. People are saying Rourke's after the ranch. That he moved himself into a permanent position so he could get close enough to... He stopped. Chose the next words. To make himself appealing. To you. Given the circumstances. Lenora set down her coffee cup. The circumstances being that I'm a widow with property. Yes, ma'am. And what exactly do people think Callan Rourke wants from the circumstances? Gibbons looked deeply uncomfortable, a wealthy wife. And 9,000 acres. The kitchen was quiet. And what do you think? Lenora said. He met her eyes. I think Rourke is the best horseman I've ever worked alongside, and he came back to Silver Briar because it has the best horses in the county, same as he always did. I think the talk is being stirred up by people who've got a reason to stir it. Lenora already suspected which person had the most to gain from planting that particular story. She just didn't have anything solid yet. She sat with the information and did not say anything to Rourke about it. But she watched. She watched the way he handled himself with the hands. The way he was straight with suppliers. The way he spent his wages. She knew from the bank in town that he was paying down the homestead debt in careful increments, the way a man does when he's counting every dollar and knows what it costs. He bought Maisie new boots in July. She noticed because the girl showed up at the ranch one Saturday with boots that fit properly for the first time since Lenora had known her. And Maisie mentioned it with the mix of pleasure and slight guilt of a child who knows something cost more than it should have. She watched the way he was with Maisie, not performing fatherhood for an audience. Just present, correcting her when she needed it, straight and without drama. Listening when she talked, which she did a lot. She watched, and she couldn't find the angle. Which didn't mean it wasn't there. She was honest with herself about that. She'd been fooled before, in different ways, by different people who wanted different parts of what she had. She'd learned not to trust her own judgment on the subject of who wanted her and who wanted what surrounded her. The Saturday in late July that changed things started ordinary. Maisie arrived earlier than usual, already talking before she'd tied her horse. Something about a hawk she'd seen on the ride over, and a question about whether hawks mated for life because she'd read something in one of Lenora's books that suggested they did, but wasn't completely sure she'd understood it correctly. Lenora answered the hawk question. They went through an hour of bookkeeping. Then Maisie asked if she could help Ruth in the kitchen, which was something she'd been doing lately with an enthusiasm that Lenora suspected was equal parts genuine interest in cooking and enjoyment of Ruth's company, since Ruth told very good stories and didn't treat children like they needed things simplified for them. Lenora went back to the breeding records. Around noon, Rourke appeared at the study door. "Maisie's here," he said. "She's been here since 9. He didn't look surprised exactly. Something quieter than that. "She didn't tell me she was coming today. She usually doesn't." He leaned against the doorframe, not aggressively, just standing the way he did when he was thinking through something. "I don't want her to be a burden on you." "She isn't." "Mrs. Ashcombe, she isn't, Rourke. She's good company, and she's good with the horses, and she's learning bookkeeping faster than most adults I've tried to teach it to." Lenora kept her eyes on the ledger. "If it becomes a problem, I'll tell you." He was quiet. "She talks about her mother sometimes," Lenora said, without quite planning to. The things her mother told her. A pause. "Yeah," he said, voice different, quieter. "She does that. She was clearly someone worth listening to." "She was." He cleared his throat. "Maisie's got a lot of her. More every year." Lenora looked up then. He was looking past her at something that wasn't in the room, the expression of a person visiting a memory. Then he seemed to realize she was watching and came back. "Sorry. I came to tell you one of the Billings buyers sent a letter. Came to the bunkhouse by accident instead of the main house." He held out the envelope. She took it. Their hands didn't touch. "Thank you," she said. He left. She sat with the letter in her hands for a moment without opening it. The dinner happened by accident. Or it happened the way things do, when neither person is willing to admit they engineered it slightly. Maisie was still at Silver Briar at 5:30, helping Ruth finish a pot of stew that had started as kitchen practice and turned into an actual substantial meal. And when Rourke came to collect her at 6, he walked into a kitchen that smelled like something worth staying for, and Ruth said, completely without guile, that there was more than enough, and it would be wasteful not to eat it. The 4 of them sat at the kitchen table: Lenora, Rourke, Maisie, and Ruth, who ate with them in the comfortable way of a woman who had long since established that she wasn't a servant in the formal sense and didn't intend to start being one. Maisie talked. She was good at filling a table with conversation, asking questions and following the answers, and looping back to things from 3 topics ago with a memory that missed nothing. She asked Ruth about the best way to keep a pie crust from getting soggy, and then asked Lenora whether the breeding records were accurate going back more than 5 years, because she'd noticed a gap in 1,882, and then asked her father whether a horse could tell if you were nervous, and whether that was why the young bay in the east pasture kept sidestepping away from Emmett the hand. Rourke answered that one with complete seriousness. Yes, and Emmett's nervous because he got thrown last spring and hasn't admitted it yet. The horse knows. Should someone tell Emmett? Someone already did. He looked at his stew. He didn't take it well. Ruth made a sound that might have been a suppressed laugh. Lenora felt something she had been carefully not feeling for several weeks, sit down comfortably at the table alongside them. After Ruth had gone, and Maisie had been dispatched to get her coat and her horse ready, Lenora and Rourke were briefly alone in the kitchen. He picked up his coffee cup, and she was clearing the ledger she'd brought to the table during dinner, and the silence between them was the kind that doesn't need filling. Then Maisie came back through the kitchen door, cheeks red from the evening air, and stopped in the middle of the room with the expression of someone who has been thinking about something carefully and has decided to say it. "Papa," she said, "I think you should marry Mrs. Ashcombe." The kitchen did something dramatic with its silence. Rourke set his coffee cup down with a precision that suggested he was concentrating very hard on not choking on what he'd just swallowed. Lenora went very still with her hand on the ledger. Maisie looked between them with the patience of someone who has made a reasonable argument and is waiting for the reasonable response. "Maisie." Rourke's voice came out carefully. "I've thought about it," she said. "She has a big house with nobody in it. We have a little house with nobody to be my mama. It seems foolish to leave it that way when the solution is right there." That is not how he stopped. Started again. That is not a reason to stop again. Lenora looked at the girl, 8 years old, watching her with the direct simplicity of someone who genuinely cannot understand why the adults in the room are making this complicated. "Maisie," Lenora said, keeping her voice level, "I appreciate the thought. Very much. But these things don't work the way they work in arithmetic. Can't just line up the columns." Maisie considered this with visible skepticism. "Mama said most things that seem complicated are actually simple, and people make them complicated because they're scared." Neither adult in the room said anything. Maisie looked at her father. "Are you scared?" Rourke picked up his hat from the peg by the door. "Go get your horse. Pucko, get your horse," said with the particular firm evenness of a man who has reached his absolute limit. Not angry, just done. Maisie went. They heard her boots on the porch steps. The kitchen was very quiet. Rourke stood with his hat in his hands and didn't look at Lenora. "I'm sorry," he said. "She doesn't. She's not trying to." "I know what she's doing," Lenora said, quietly. He looked up. The expression on his face was something she hadn't seen from him before. Not quite embarrassment. More complicated than that. "She misses having a mother," he said. "She's attached to you. I've let it go on longer than—" He stopped. "I should have said something sooner." "Rourke." Lenora met his eyes. "I don't want you to say something sooner. I don't want to be the woman who tells that child she's been coming here too often." He held her gaze, not looking away from the scar or at it. Just at her. "Right," he said. Finally, he put on his hat. "Good night, Mrs. Ashcombe." "Good night." He went out. Through the window, she could see him cross the yard to where Maisie was waiting, with their horses, and she heard the low sound of his voice, not the words, and then the girl's voice answering, and then the sound of hooves on the drive getting quieter. Lenora stood in her kitchen for a long time after they were gone. She was being careful. She knew she was being careful. She had very good reasons for being careful, and she had laid them all out for herself on multiple occasions, in the way a sensible woman accounts for her actual circumstances rather than what she might wish they were. She was wealthy. He was not. She had been kind to his daughter. He was a decent man who might feel obligated or indebted, or who might simply be the kind of man who does the next logical thing when a woman is good to his child. She could not fully trust herself to tell the difference between a man who cared about her and a man who had reasoned his way into caring about her because it made sense for his situation. This was the wall she kept running into, and it was a real wall. She'd built it from real material. The talk in town didn't slow down. By August, it had acquired specific details. The way rumors do when they're being fed from somewhere, people were saying that Rourke had pushed for a permanent position deliberately, that he'd coached Maisie to befriend the widow, that the whole arrangement had been calculated from the start. Lenora heard it from enough directions that she made herself look at it honestly. Was it possible? Yes. She wasn't naive. She'd seen people do elaborate things for simpler motives. Was it what she saw in him? No, but that didn't mean her seeing was reliable. She handled it the way she handled things she couldn't resolve. She put it aside and watched and waited and kept working. Then came the morning in mid-August when everything sharpened. She was in the main barn going through the registration papers on the 2 young horses that had been off the book. She'd been building the documentation case, slowly and carefully since spring, when 2 of the hands came in from the east fence, with a piece of information that landed like a stone in still water. 3 of Silver Briar's branded horses had turned up at a sale yard in Billings, sold under different registration numbers, altered brands. Not missing horses. Horses that were currently accounted for in Silver Briar's stalls, which meant someone had forged the documents. Lenora stood in the barn and felt the ground shift under her. The forged papers showed a transaction. The transaction was in a hand she didn't recognize. The signature at the bottom was not hers, but the name underneath it, the name of the man who had allegedly sold 3 Silver Briar horses to a Billings buyer under false brands, was not Lenora Ashcombe. It was Callan Rourke. She sat with the documents for 2 hours before she showed anyone. She read them 4 times. She looked at the signature, at the dates, at the registration numbers that had been altered with enough skill that someone had spent time doing it. Then she sent for Gibbons. Gibbons looked at the papers and went white. He'd have had access to the registration records, he said, carefully, like he didn't want to say it. So would 6 other people on this property. Mrs. Ashcombe, who brought these to you? She said. Where did this information come from? He looked at his hands. Ryder came from Copper Hollow this morning. Brought the papers and a note. I don't know who sent it. The rider was just a hired man. Lenora looked at the papers again. Hired from where, she thought. By whom? She thought about Sterling Voss, who had stood in her parlor 8 months ago and said she was making things harder than they needed to be. She thought about Callan Rourke, who had come back to Silver Briar in the spring for the horses and nothing else. She thought about Maisie at the kitchen table saying, "He doesn't say things he doesn't mean." Don't say anything to anyone, Lenora told Gibbons. Not to the hands, not to Rourke, not to anyone in town. I need 3 days. Mrs. Ashcombe, if those documents are genuines. 3 days, she said, and then I'll know whether they are. Gibbons left. Lenora folded the forged papers back into the envelope. She needed to think. She needed to be honest with herself about what she was thinking and why, and whether she was seeing clearly or whether she was seeing what she wanted to see. She had trusted men before and been wrong about the reasons behind the trust. She knew that. But she also knew what forged documents looked like when someone with money and motive wanted a man removed from a position he occupied. She sat in the main house study until the lamp burned low and the ranch went quiet outside, and the only sound was the horses in the south pasture moving through the summer dark. She was still sitting there when she heard, faintly, from somewhere in the direction of the bunkhouse, the sound of a child's voice asking a question. Maisie, still here this late, which meant she'd fallen asleep somewhere on the property after dinner and nobody'd noticed until now, and Rourke had come looking for her. She heard his answer, low and even, and then his boots on the gravel, and then quiet. She looked at the forged envelope in her hands. She thought about the decision she was already most of the way to making, and whether she was making it because she was right, or because she was someone who had been lonely for a long time and was afraid of being wrong about one of the few people who had made her feel less so. Both things could be true. She'd learned that much. The real question was what she was going to do anyway. She set the envelope on the desk. She picked up her pen. She began to write. What Lenora wrote that night was not a letter. It was a list. She had always thought better in lists, not the decorative kind, not the kind that made a person feel organized without actually being organized, but the real kind, the kind where you put everything down without deciding in advance which column it belongs to, and then you look at it honestly and see what you actually have. On one side, the evidence against Callan Rourke, forged documents with his name on them. Transaction that appeared to show Silver Briar horses sold under altered brands. His access to the registration records. The timing, a permanent position secured in spring. A relationship with the owner's daughter established through the owner, a situation that any man with calculating intentions could have engineered if he'd been patient enough. On the other side, everything she had watched for 4 months. She wrote it all down: the Carlisle letter, the Eastern pasture argument, the way he'd sat at Ruth's kitchen table and answered Maisie's questions about horses without performing patience, just actually being patient, the way he spent his wages on the homestead debt first, the new boots that came after, not before, the way he'd looked at her in the mercantile in November at her, not at the scar and not away from it. She sat with both columns for a long time. Then she wrote one more thing at the bottom of the page, separate from both columns. The documents are too clean. She'd been looking at Silver Briar's records for 8 months. She knew what Rourke's handwriting looked like. She'd seen it on feed orders and stock reports and the notes he's left on the breeding calendar. The signature on the forged papers was a reasonable imitation. Not perfect, but reasonable. Reasonable meant someone had practiced. Reasonable meant someone had a sample to work from. Reasonable meant someone with access to Silver Briar documents, which in the past 8 months had included Rourke, Gibbons, herself, the previous foreman who had left suddenly the year before, and the man who had been handling the accounts at the bank in Copper Hollow before Lenora had moved everything to Helena, and Sterling Voss, who had sat in her parlor twice and spoken with the particular confidence of a man who expected to eventually get what he wanted. She folded the list, put it in the desk drawer, and went to bed. She did not sleep particularly well. She was honest with herself about that too. In the morning, she sent a rider to Helena with instructions for her solicitor. She asked for 2 things: a full investigation of the Billings sale yard transaction, and any information available about Sterling Voss's business dealings in the past 3 years specifically, any transactions involving property adjacent to Silver Briar, any legal proceedings, any financial arrangements that seemed structured to create pressure on a neighboring operation. The rider left before breakfast. Lenora went to the main barn and found Rourke already there, which was not surprising, and stood in the doorway for a moment watching him work before she said anything. He was checking one of the older mares, the one she'd been most worried about since spring, going through the examination with the slow, methodical attention he brought to everything, and the mare was standing for it without fuss, which meant something about the quality of the handling. "Rourke," she said. He looked up. "I need to ask you something directly, and I need you to answer the same way." He straightened. Something in his face shifted into the careful attention he gave to things that mattered. "All right. Have you had any contact with buyers outside of what I've approved? Anyone I don't know about? Any arrangement involving Silver Briar horses that wasn't documented through the main records?" The silence lasted exactly as long as it took him to understand what she was asking. "Not long. No," he said. "Nothing in Billings? I haven't been to Billings since March, and that was with Gibbons to look at the Carlisle operation you ended up not selling to." His voice was even, but his eyes had gone sharp. "What happened?" It wasn't quite a question, she told him. Not all of it, not the list she'd made the night before, not the conclusion she'd already mostly reached, but the documents, the forged transaction, the name at the bottom. He was quiet through the whole of it. When she finished, the barn was very still. "My name," he said. "Yes." He looked at his hands. Then up. "And you're asking me directly instead of just ending the position. I told you what I wanted from you. Honest answers before problems become worse." That goes both directions. Something moved through his expression that she couldn't quite name. Not gratitude exactly. Something rawer than that. "I didn't do it," he said. "I know." He paused. "I think I know," she corrected, because she owed him the actual truth, not the comfortable version. "I'm not able to be completely certain yet. I've sent to Helena for an investigation. Until I have more information, I'm not doing anything with those documents except keeping them where they are." Stood with that for a moment. "Whoever sent them," he said. "They wanted you to move fast, before you had time to look at them carefully." "Yes." Voss, she didn't confirm it, she didn't deny it either. "I don't have evidence yet, but you're thinking it." "I'm thinking it," she said. "Don't do anything. Don't approach him. Don't mention this to any of the hands. Don't change anything about your work or your routine. If someone is watching to see how this lands, I want them to see nothing." He held her gaze for a long moment. "You're trusting me with this," he said. "You didn't have to do that. I'm also asking you to trust me with your reputation, temporarily, while I figure out what's actually happening." She met his eyes. That seemed like a fair trade. He nodded slowly. "Fair trade," he said. The Helena solicitor's first response came back 9 days later. What it contained was interesting enough that Lenora read it 3 times before she called Gibbons into the study. Voss had been involved in 2 property disputes in the past 4 years. One had been settled quietly with a cash payment. The other had resulted in a neighboring rancher selling out at well below market value after a period of what the legal documents described as sustained commercial pressure, a phrase that Lenora's solicitor underlined and noted covered everything. From forged debt records to bribed local officials to a water diversion that had mysteriously cut off the northern pasture of the targeted property for 1 full grazing season. The rancher who'd sold was named Pruett. His land now belonged to Sterling Voss. "He does this," Lenora said, out loud. "Not to Gibbons, really. Just to the room." "Ma'am?" "He finds the weakness in a person's situation, and he applies pressure until they break or sell or accept whatever terms he's offering." She looked at the letter. Pruett had debt. "I have apparently an unmarried foreman whose name could be attached to a theft, which would discredit him and damage me simultaneously." She set the letter down. If the story had gotten out properly, with enough detail, it would have done 2 things. Made Rourke look like a thief, and made me look like a fool for trusting him. Either I'd be seen as incompetent or as complicit. Gibbons sat across from her with his hat in his lap. "What do you want to do?" This was the part she'd been thinking about for 9 days. The obvious move was to go to the county sheriff with what she had. But what she had wasn't enough yet. A pattern from another county, a suspicion, forged papers that could be explained away as a disgruntled former employee, a distant transaction in Billings that needed more tracing. A lawyer would pull it apart in an afternoon. She needed Voss to move again. She needed him to think the first move had worked. She needed to give him a reason to take the next step. "I'm going to put Rourke in charge of the breeding herd," she said. Gibbons stared at her. The full herd, not just the management role he has now. "I mean visible, documented, public control. I'll register it formally with the county. I'll let it be known in town." She looked at Gibbons steadily. "If Voss has someone watching Silver Briar, and I think he does, they'll report back that I've doubled down on Rourke instead of cutting him loose. That will tell Voss the first documents didn't work. And then he'll try something larger," Gibbons said. His voice was careful. "Yes, Mrs. Ashcombe, if he moves against the herd directly, then we'll catch him doing it." She said it with more calm than she entirely felt. "Rourke will know what to watch for. You'll know. I'll alert the 2 hands I trust most. If someone comes onto Silver Briar property to steal horses or plant more evidence, I want us to be ready. And if it goes wrong," she looked at him, "it's already wrong, Gibbons. Someone is trying to take this ranch from me by destroying the reputation of the people who work here. Wrong is already the situation. I'm just deciding how to operate inside it." Gibbons turned his hat twice. "All right," he said. "I'm with you," she told Rourke that afternoon. He listened to the whole plan without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for long enough that she could hear the horses in the near pasture and a woodpecker working somewhere in the tree line north of the barn. "You're using the breeding herd as bait," he said. "Essentially, if this goes badly, you lose the most valuable horses on the property. If I do nothing, I lose the property eventually anyway. Voss will keep going until he finds something that works." She looked at him directly. "I know what I'm risking. I've thought it through." "Have you thought through what it means for me if it goes wrong?" She hadn't been expecting that question. Not framed that way. "What do you mean? If this plan fails, if the horses get taken or damaged, or if Voss manages to make the frame stick, you lose the herd. I lose my name and my livelihood and any chance of another position in this territory." He wasn't angry. He was stating facts the way he did. "I'm not saying don't do it. I'm saying I want to be sure you've thought about that piece too." "I have," she said. And then, because he deserved the honest version, "It's part of why I'm asking instead of just doing it." Something shifted in his face. "You could have just made it happen." The owner. I could have. He was quiet again. I'm in, he said. The announcement went out through the county clerk's office 2 days later. Formal documentation. Callan Rourke, ranch foreman of Silver Briar, appointed as manager of record for the Silver Briar breeding herd, including Raven and the full roster of registered mares and foals. Lenora sent copies to 3 separate business contacts in Copper Hollow, all of them reliable sources of information who she knew would mention it in the right circles. Within a week, she could feel the change in the air. People in town looked at her differently when she came in for supplies. Not cruelly, not in the way of before, but with the particular sideways attention of people who think that you're watching a woman make a mistake and haven't decided yet whether to tell her. 2 men she'd never spoken to personally made a point of coming up to her, outside Halverson's, to mention, carefully, that there was talk about her foreman, and she might want to be cautious. She thanked them and said she was aware and continued about her business. She heard nothing from Voss. That silence told her more than words would have. The first week of September, the weather shifted. Not dramatically, not yet, but the nights had teeth now, and the mornings had the particular flat gray of a sky that is making plans. On the 4th day of September, Rourke found her in the study before breakfast. She knew from the set of his face before he spoke. Someone cut the south fence line last night, he said. Section between the lower pasture and the creek boundary. She set her coffee down. The breeding herd is in the south pasture. Still there. I checked before I came here. But the fence is cut clean, not broken cut, and there were boot prints in the soft ground near the creek that weren't there yesterday morning. Stood. Someone was scouting, looked at the herd and left. Or got spooked. Either way, it wasn't accidental. He looked at her steadily. It's coming, Mrs. Ashcombe. Could be tonight. Could be a few nights out. They've marked the approach. She thought fast. I'll send Gibbons into town today for supplies. Let him be visible. Let it look like a normal day. I want 2 men on the south pasture after dark. Hidden. Not patrolling. I don't want anyone to see movement from outside the fence line. She looked at him. Can you manage it without it looking managed? Yes. Rourke. She stopped him at the door. Be careful. Turned. Something in his expression she hadn't seen before, not quite the quiet he always carried. Something underneath it. You too, he said. She spent the day working. She ate. She went through the breeding records with a focus she had to force because part of her attention was on the south pasture and the creek boundary and the question of when. Turned out the answer was 3 nights later. The storm came in faster than anyone predicted. By 9 o'clock, the temperature had dropped 15 degrees, and the wind was moving across the property in long horizontal sheets that made the lamp in the study gutter, even through closed windows. Lenora was still awake. She'd stopped, pretending she was going to sleep on the nights when the men were positioned in the south pasture, when she heard the first sound from outside that didn't belong. She was at the window before the thought was finished. In the dark and the driving weather, she couldn't see anything clearly, but she could see the lantern light down by the south barn, swinging wrong, not steady, not a man walking with a purpose he owned, but the frantic movement of light in the hands of someone who is frightened. She heard a shout, then another. Then she heard the sound of horses moving, a lot of horses, the particular chaotic percussion of a herd that has been disturbed and is deciding which direction to go. She went for her coat. Ruth appeared in the hallway. Mrs. Ashcombe, stay inside. Lock the main door after me. You can't go out in... Lenora was already through the door. The wind hit her like something physical. She kept moving toward the south pasture, following the moving light and the sound of horses and voices, and when she got to the fence line, she could see what had happened. 3 men. 2 of Rourke's trusted hands had gotten one of them down. The second was running toward the creek in the dark. The third had managed to get a rope on 2 of the mares, and they were dragging him sideways as they bolted, and the sound of the herd in full panic was loud enough to feel in her chest. Couldn't see Rourke. She moved along the fence line toward the gate, scanning. The herd had broken for the north end of the pasture and was already beyond the fence through the section that had been cut. She could hear them in the darkness past the pasture boundary. The hoofbeats going irregular, and then splitting as individual horses found different directions. She heard Rourke's voice somewhere in the dark ahead. Couldn't make out the words. Then she heard his horse. Then she heard nothing from either. One of the hands materialized from the dark near her. It was Emmett, who Rourke had said was nervous around the young bay, and was managing it by not admitting it. "Where's Rourke?" she asked. "Went after the herd," Emmett said, breathing hard. "The north fence is open. They could go into the upper creek draws if they keep running." He went to turn them. He looked at her. "Mrs. Ashcombe, it's getting bad out here. You shouldn't, the man you've got down. Hold him. Don't let him talk to the other one." She looked into the dark where the horses had gone. How long has Rourke been out there? Emmett thought. 20 minutes. Maybe more. She stood in the wind and the rain and looked at the open north fence and the dark beyond it and the silence where Rourke's voice had been. 20 minutes on a running horse in a creek draw in weather like this. She went back to the barn. Her mare was inside, not in the pasture. She saddled her in 3 minutes, which was not fast enough, but was the best she could do, and rode for the north fence. The draw country north of the upper pasture was rough, even in good weather, shallow ravines, cut by spring snowmelt, rock outcroppings, tree cover that turned the dark into something absolute. She rode with her face down against the rain and the wind, and kept the mare moving by feel as much as sight, following the tracks where the mud was soft enough to hold them. She found 2 of the mares first standing together near a rock shelf, blowing hard, deciding they were done running. She moved past them, kept going. She heard his horse before she saw anything. The animal was standing at the edge of a drop-off, not a cliff, more like the steep side of an eroded creek bank with the rains trailing. No rider. Rourke. The wind took the word. She called again. "Here." The voice came from below the drop-off. She dismounted, secured her mare to the nearest tree branch, and went to the edge. He was down in the creek bed, maybe 10 feet below. He'd gotten himself into a sitting position against the bank wall. In the thin light she could see his left arm was braced against his body at the wrong angle, and there was something dark on the side of his face. "How bad?" she said. "Arm. I've had worse." A pause. "I'm not sure I've had exactly this." He looked up at her. Even from 10 feet and in the dark she could see the effort it was taking him to stay upright and talking. The herd split. Most of them went east. "I think they'll come back to the fence line when the weather settles." "Stop worrying about the horses," she said. "I need to get you up. There's a slope about 30 feet east. You can get the horses down to the creek level. Rourke, I need you to focus on the getting up part." A sound that might have been a laugh on a better evening. "I'm focused. Just telling you the route." She went 30 feet east. Found the slope. Got her mare down to creek level and led her back to where Rourke was. Getting him up from the creek bed onto the horse was not a smooth operation. It involved considerable effort from both of them, 2 false starts, one moment where he made a sound through his teeth that he immediately cut off, and a final version that was mostly him pulling with his good arm and her pushing from below. He ended up on the horse, not elegantly, but on it. She walked beside the mare and led them both back up the slope and toward the pasture fence. The rain was letting up slightly. The wind had not. "You rode out," he said, from somewhere above her. "Yes. After I told you," he stopped himself. He hadn't exactly told her to stay inside. They both knew that. "Someone had to come after you," she said. "You could have sent Emmett." Emmett was managing the man they'd gotten down. She kept walking. "And I wanted to come." Silence. Just the sound of the weather and the mare's hooves, and the distant sound of the herd, settling somewhere east of the fence. Lenora. He said her name the way people say a name, when they've been using a different form of address long enough that using the right one feels like saying something larger. She kept walking. "Don't talk too much. You might have cracked something in that arm." "I know I cracked something in that arm." A pause. His voice was rougher now, the cold getting into it. "I've been trying to think of the right thing to say to you for 2 months, and I can't do it when I'm falling off a horse in a rainstorm, so I'm going to say it wrong." "The day you showed me those documents," he said. "You didn't have to tell me. You could have just ended it, and I wouldn't have had any argument. And you told me anyway. You said it was a fair trade." Another pause. The horse stepped carefully over a rock. "I've been working for wages since I was 17 years old. I've never had a fair trade before. I didn't know what to do with it." Kept her face forward. "You don't have to—" "I'm not saying it because of the ranch," he said. Quiet. Underneath the pain and the weather and everything else. Just plain. I want you to know that. Whatever you decide to do with any of this. I'm not saying it for the ranch. She stopped walking. The mare stopped, in the dark and the rain, with his arm cracked and her hair soaking through, and the herd somewhere east, making their way back to familiar ground. She looked up at him. I know, she said. And she did know. She wasn't certain of many things, but she was certain of that. He nodded once, like they'd agreed on something. She started walking again. They got back to the main fence line 40 minutes later. Emmett had both the captured men secured. Gibbons had come out from the bunkhouse with 2 more hands and was already organizing to go after the scattered herd at first light. The rain had genuinely eased off now, dropping to a thin, cold drizzle. Rourke dismounted badly and stayed on his feet through what appeared to be sheer stubbornness. Lenora had Ruth boil water and sent Gibbons for the medicine kit and made Rourke sit in the kitchen, which he did without arguing, which told her more about his condition than he was letting on. The arm was broken. She'd seen a broken arm before. She splinted it as best she could and told him he needed a doctor in the morning, and he said he'd go when the herd was counted. You'll go in the morning, she said, when the herd is counted. Rourke, it's my herd to count, he said, stubborn. In pain but stubborn, which seemed to be his baseline operating condition. Give me an hour at first light, and then I'll go. She looked at him across the kitchen table. 1 hour, she said. He almost smiled. Not quite. 1 hour. Ruth made coffee and neither of them slept. The 2 captured men were secured in the attack room by Emmett and talked more than they probably intended to in the small hours of the morning. Not from skill on anyone's part, they were cold and scared, and one of them had a temper that didn't serve him well under pressure. By 4 in the morning, Gibbons had heard enough to come to the main house with a name. Sterling Voss. Not guesswork. One of the men had worked for Voss directly for 3 years. He gave the name the way people give names when they've decided the person who hired them is not worth protecting. Gibbons stood in the kitchen doorway and delivered this information. Lenora looked at Rourke across the table. He looked back at her. Neither of them said anything, but something in the air between them settled. The way a question settles when the answer finally arrives, and it turns out to be exactly what you thought it was, except now you can act on it. Stood up. Send to the county sheriff at first light, she said to Gibbons. Send to my solicitor in Helena with a separate rider. And make sure those 2 men are still in that tack room when the sheriff arrives. She looked at Rourke. You doctor, then herd count. You switched the order, he said. Yes, I did. He considered arguing. Then he looked at his arm and apparently did some private calculation about his leverage in the situation. Doctor first, he said. Gibbons left. Ruth refilled the coffee. Outside, the rain had stopped entirely. In the east, the sky was beginning to separate itself from the darkness in the slow way of early morning, the black becoming something closer to gray, the shapes of the barn and the fence and the far tree line starting to exist again. Lenora sat with her coffee and looked at the window and thought about Sterling Voss waking up that morning in his comfortable house at Crescent Creek and waiting for news. The news he was going to get was not the news he was expecting. She thought about Callan Rourke across the table, drinking Ruth's coffee with his broken arm in a splint, and his face still carrying the mark from where he'd hit the creek bank. Sitting in her kitchen in the dark the same way he did everything, without complaint, without performance, just steadily present. She thought about Maisie, asleep in her cabin 3 miles away, not knowing any of this had happened. She thought about what Rourke had said in the creek draw, what he'd meant by it, what she'd meant when she said she knew. She didn't look at the window reflection. She'd stopped doing that automatically weeks ago, and she'd only recently noticed when the stopping had become a habit instead of a choice. Sky kept getting lighter. By the time the first real gray of morning came through the window glass, she could see the south pasture from where she sat, and she could see the horses, her horses, Rourke's horses, Silver Briar's horses moving back toward the fence line in the slow, calm way of animals that have been frightened and have recovered and are now simply hungry. All of them accounted for. Everyone. The sheriff arrived from Copper Hollow before 8 in the morning, which meant someone had ridden through the night to reach him, which meant Gibbons had sent the writer earlier than Lenora had instructed, and she was not going to argue with the result. Sheriff Dale Morrow was 53, built like a man who had spent 3 decades in physical work before the badge, and he had the particular quality of stillness that belongs to people who have seen enough bad situations that new ones don't rattle them much. He came into the kitchen, looked at the 2 secured men in the tack room, looked at Rourke's splinted arm, looked at Lenora, and said, "Start from the beginning." She did. She gave him everything in order: the forged documents in August, the investigation she'd sent to Helena, the patterns she'd found in Voss's prior dealings with the Pruitt property, the cut fence line, the storm, the horses, the men she was currently holding in her tack room. She put the forged papers on the kitchen table and the Helena solicitor's letter beside them and let Morrow read both without interrupting him. He read slowly. He was the kind of man who read slowly. When he finished, he looked up. "You've been sitting on this since August. I needed more than suspicion. You could have come to me with the documents. With forged papers and a pattern from another county, and no witnesses and no direct connection to Voss, you'd have had a difficult time building a case, Sheriff. And in the meantime, the story about Rourke would have been in every feed store between here and Helena." She met his eyes. "I needed him to move, so I gave him a reason." Morrow looked at Rourke. "How's the arm?" "Broken," Rourke said. "I'll live." "You go see Doc Hendricks before noon." "So I've been told." Morrow turned back to Lenora, the men in the tack room. "One of them gave you Voss by name. Emmett heard it. Gibbons heard it. I can provide both as witnesses. I'll need their statements." He folded the papers carefully and put them back on the table. "Voss has money and he has contacts. He'll hire the best attorney in the territory, and they'll work every angle they can find." He was direct about it, which she appreciated. "This won't be simple or fast. I know. But what you've got here," he tapped the pile of documents, "is more than most people come to me with. Between the Billings transaction, the forged signature, the prior pattern with Pruitt's property, and 2 men willing to talk, there's a case." He stood. "I'll ride to Crescent Creek this morning." Lenora walked him to the door. "Mrs. Ashcombe," he said before he stepped out, "next time you're running an operation like this on your own property to catch a man committing crimes, consider telling me first." "Next time," she said. "I hope there isn't one." He almost smiled. "Fair enough." The arrest of Sterling Voss happened that same morning, before 10 o'clock, and the news reached Copper Hollow by noon, in the way that news reached Copper Hollow, through approximately 6 overlapping conversations in the feed store, the Mercantile, and the street in front of the post office, each version slightly different from the last, all of them containing the central fact that Voss had been taken in by Sheriff Morrow on charges related to horse theft, fraud, and conspiracy. By nightfall, 2 additional facts had filtered through: that the widow Ashcombe had assembled the evidence herself over several months, and that the foreman she'd been trusting, the one people had been saying was probably after her ranch, had ridden out in a storm to recover her stolen herd and come back with a broken arm and all the horses. Copper Hollow adjusted its opinion the way small towns adjust opinions noisily, completely, and without much acknowledgement that the previous opinion had ever existed. Lenora heard about the adjustment from Ruth, who heard it from the woman who delivered eggs, who had apparently gotten the full account from 2 separate sources before breakfast. Ruth reported it with the flat precision of a woman who has been observing human long enough to find it predictable. "Now they're calling you brave," Ruth said. She was making biscuits. She made biscuits when things happened, as a kind of processing mechanism. "And Rourke's a hero, apparently. Last month they were calling him a thief," Lenora said. Last month Voss hadn't been arrested yet. Lenora sat at the kitchen table with her coffee and thought about the particular hollowness of being praised by the same people who had recently been cruel, and how that hollowness was not the same as ingratitude, but wasn't the same as comfort either. "People are saying you should have come to town to make an announcement," Ruth added. "Some of the women want to organize something, a gathering." "No, I told them you'd say that." "Did you tell them why?" Ruth put her biscuits in the oven. "I told them you were busy running a ranch." She closed the oven door. Was that the right answer? That was the right answer. Rourke came back from Doc Hendricks in Copper Hollow that afternoon, with his arm properly set and splinted, and a look on his face that suggested the visit had involved more conversation than he'd wanted. He went directly to the south pasture to count the herd, which Lenora had expected, and came to the main house an hour later, with the count on a piece of paper. Every horse accounted for. 2 mares with minor injuries from the storm. Nothing that wouldn't heal. He set the paper on the study desk. She was working through correspondence. The Hellas solicitor had sent 3 more letters in 2 days, and there was going to be a legal process that required her active attention for the foreseeable future. Doc Hendricks wants me off full work for 2 weeks, Rourke said. What are you planning to do about that? Half work. She looked up. Rourke, the herd needs managing. You've got a buyer coming from Billings in 10 days. I'll handle the buyer. Emmett can manage the routine. 2 weeks. She met his eyes. I need you functional for the long run, not half functional for 10 days and then broken down for a month. Stood with that. 2 weeks is a long time, he said. It wasn't a complaint, exactly. More like a man trying to articulate something without saying the actual thing. It's 14 days, she said. You can still do the records. You can still tell me what decisions to make if I come to you and ask. Something shifted in his expression. You'd do that. You have better horse instincts than anyone on this property. Breaking your arm doesn't change that. He was quiet. Sit down, she said. I have 3 letters that need someone to look at them before I respond, and one of them involves the breeding registration question we discussed in July that I still haven't fully resolved. He sat. She handed him the letters. They worked like that for 2 hours, her writing and him reading, and both of them talking through the decisions. It was not the way she'd operated the business before spring. She had been accustomed to making decisions alone, checking her own reasoning, catching her own errors. She was discovering, gradually and somewhat against her will, that this was slower and better. That was the day Maisie found out. She arrived on her horse at 4 in the afternoon, which was a school day and therefore unexpected, and the expression on her face when she came through the kitchen door made Lenora's stomach drop slightly before she realized it was panic, not injury. What happened to Papa's arm, Maisie said. Not a question. He broke it, Rourke said from the study doorway. He had the same expression he always had when his daughter surprised him, which was somewhere between resigned and privately pleased. Who told you? Everyone at school told me. They said you got in a fight with horse thieves. She looked at him the way children look at parents who have frightened them, equal parts relief and anger that the relief was necessary. You didn't tell me. You were at school, Papa. It happened in the night. You were asleep. I didn't want to. He stopped. I didn't want to scare you. You scared me more by not telling me. She crossed the kitchen and stopped in front of him and looked at the splinted arm with her jaw set in the particular way she had, the way that looked like his jaw and sounded like her mother's reasoning. Does it hurt? Some. Don't say some like it doesn't. He looked at Lenora over the top of his daughter's head. Lenora looked back at him. She was not going to help him with this one. It hurts more than some, he admitted, but it's set properly and it'll heal. Maisie stood for a moment. Then she put her arms around him carefully, the side without the broken arm, and he put his good hand on the back of her head, and they stood like that in the kitchen doorway for a moment, with the afternoon light coming in behind them. Lenora looked at her paperwork. Mrs. Ashcombe, Maisie said. She'd separated from her father and was looking at Lenora with the directness she brought to things that mattered to her. Did you really go out in the storm to find him? I went to help bring the horses back, Lenora said. Carefully. That's not what Emmett said. Maisie's eyes were steady. Emmett said you saddled your own horse and went into the draw country in the dark, because nobody else went and you didn't wait to see if someone else would. Kitchen was quiet. Emmett talks too much, Rourke said. Emmett told the truth, Maisie said. She kept looking at Lenora. Thank you, she said. Simply. No performance in it. You don't need to. He's my papa, the girls said. I think I do. The legal proceedings against Sterling Voss moved faster than Morrow had predicted, and slower than Lenora's patience wanted. Her Helena solicitor, a careful, deliberate man named Aldous Fry, who had been handling the Ashcombe accounts since Edmund was alive, came to Copper Hollow in person in the third week of September to oversee the documentation. He was in the main house study for 2 days, going through everything Lenora had assembled. At the end of the second day, he sat back in his chair and looked at her over his spectacles with the expression of a man who has just revised an estimate upward. "This is more thorough than what most trained investigators produce," he said. "I had several months and a strong motivation. The Pruitt precedent is particularly useful. Voss's attorney will argue the two cases are unrelated, but the structural similarities are close enough that a judge will want to look at both." He tapped the folder in front of him. "The two men in custody are the linchpin, if they hold to their statements. The one who gave us Voss's name has nothing to lose by holding to it," Lenora said. "He's already facing the theft charge. His only way to a lighter outcome is full cooperation. And the other one? Less certain. He's younger. Scared. She'd spoken to Morrow about it. But scared people sometimes tell the truth when they realize the person they're protecting has already left them to take the consequences alone." Fry nodded slowly. "Voss's attorney filed to have the charges reduced yesterday. I've submitted the counter documentation this morning." He looked at her. "This will still take several months, possibly longer. Courts move at their own pace. As long as they move," she said. Fry left the following morning. The legal machinery ground on in the background, producing paperwork and dates and motions that Lenora read carefully and then put in their proper file. Life on Silver Briar continued. October came in cold and clear, the kind of weather that makes the work hard and the light beautiful, and the horses moved through the gold grass of the pastures in a way that made even practical people stop for a moment and look. Rourke's arm healed. He was back to full work by the third week of October, which was a week ahead of when Doc Hendricks had cleared him and 2 weeks behind when he'd initially planned to return, which Lenora counted as a reasonable compromise. The Billings buyer had come and gone, and the transaction had been clean and well documented and profitable, and 3 more inquiries had come in afterward from ranches in Helena and one from as far as Cheyenne, all interested in Silver Briar bloodlines. The breeding program was working. Raven's registration was attracting the attention Rourke had said it would. Silver Briar was starting to be talked about in the right rooms for the right reasons. One evening in late October, Rourke came to the main house after supper. Not unusual, he often came by in the evenings when there was something to go over. But he came without paperwork, which was unusual, and he stood in the hallway for a moment before he said anything. "I need to talk to you about something," he said. "Not about the horses." Lenora set down her pen. "All right," he came into the study. Didn't sit. She was used to him sitting when they worked. This was different, and they both knew it. "I've been thinking about what to say for 3 weeks," he said. "I want to be clear up front that I'm not saying it to try to change your business decisions. Whatever you decide, the ranch is your ranch, and I'll continue to work it the same way I have been." "Let me finish." He looked at her steadily. "I know what people have been saying. I know some of it, some of the things people said about me wanting this position for reasons that weren't about the horses. I know you had to weigh that. I know you didn't entirely know, in August, whether they were right." A pause. "I don't want you to wonder about it anymore. I stopped wondering in August," she said. "I know, but I want to say it directly, because I think you deserve to hear it directly." He stood with his hat in his hand, the same worn hat, the same man who had stepped forward in a mercantile 11 months ago, because his daughter had said the right thing and he'd agreed with her. "I came back to Silver Briar in the spring for the horses. That part was exactly what it looked like. And then I met you. And I'd be lying if I said the horses are still the main reason I come to work in the morning." The fire in the study made a small sound. Outside the window the dark was complete, the way October dark is in Montana, with the stars clear and cold above the ridge line. "I'm not asking for anything," he said. "I'm not asking you to decide something or change something. I didn't want you to spend any more time wondering if I was calculating something. I'm not. I don't know how to do that. I tried to figure out how to be calculating once, years ago, when the homestead debt was bad, and I was so bad at it that I nearly lost the land anyway." Something like humor in the corner of his mouth. Not quite a smile. Close. "I'm only good at one thing, which is being honest about what I see in front of me. And what I see in front of me is the best person I've worked for, and the person I'd most want to keep working for. And he stopped. And more than that. But I'm not asking for more than that right now. Lenora looked at him for a long moment. She thought about 14 months of widowhood and the careful architecture of self-sufficiency she'd built in that time, and how something she hadn't planned for had come through the door of a mercantile in the form of a child in mended boots, and then stayed through the form of a quiet, honest man who couldn't calculate anything and didn't try. "You've been standing in my study for 5 minutes," she said. "You've said everything you have to say. You should sit down." He sat. The first time in this conversation he'd looked slightly uncertain. "I've been thinking about something too," she said. "Since the creek draw. Probably before that." She met his eyes. "I trust my judgment less than I used to. About people. About who wants what from me. I have good reasons for that." She kept her voice even. "I don't want you to take it personally that it took me longer than it might have." "I don't," he said. "I'd have taken longer if I were you." "I know you would have." She picked up her pen and set it down again. "I'm also going to say something that I want you to take seriously. If things develop in the direction that conversation seems to be pointing, I need it to be on ground that's level. I can't be the person who has everything, and you're the person who comes to what's mine. That would poison it eventually." He was looking at her carefully. "What does level look like?" "I don't know yet," she said honestly. "But I wanted to say it out loud, so we both know it's part of the conversation." He nodded, slow, thinking it through the way he thought everything through, all the way down. "That's fair," he said. "Good." The silence between them was different from the silences they'd had before. Not the absence of something, more like the presence of something that hadn't had room to sit down until now. "The Billings inquiry," he said after a while, moving back toward the work because they were both people who moved back toward the work, and that felt right too. "The Cheyenne one is more interesting. If they're looking for breeding stock at the level they indicated, Raven's calves." "I know," she said. She pulled the Cheyenne letter from the pile. "I was thinking the same thing." They worked for another hour. Ruth brought coffee. The fire burned down, and Lenora added wood without thinking about it. And Rourke watched her do it and didn't offer to help, because his arm was still not fully right, and they both knew it. When he left, he said goodnight the same way he always said it. But at the door he stopped, and he looked back at her, and the thing he didn't say was as clear as anything he had said. She went to bed and slept better than she had in months. November brought the first real snow, and with it the particular quieter rhythm of a ranch in winter, the herd pulled closer to shelter, the hands rotating through indoor work, the days shorter and the evenings longer. The horses needed more attention in cold weather, not less, and Rourke managed the increased demands with the same even competence he brought to everything. Maisie's visits shifted from twice a week to Saturday mornings, because the weather made the ride from her homestead longer, and Lenora had said firmly that the girl was not riding 3 miles in serious cold just to practice bookkeeping. And Rourke had agreed with equal firmness, and Maisie had argued that she'd ridden in worse and been told by both adults simultaneously that that was not the point. Maisie had looked between them with an expression Lenora hadn't quite been able to read at the time. Later she decided it had been satisfaction. The legal case against Voss moved through November with the grinding slowness Fry had predicted. 2 of the bribed officials from the county assessor's office came forward in late November, which Fry called significant. Voss's attorney filed 3 separate motions in 4 weeks, and all 3 were denied. The man who had given Voss's name in the tack room held to his statement in his formal deposition, and Lenora sat in the room during that deposition and watched the attorney try to shake him and fail, and felt something she recognized as relief settling in her chest. December came. On a Saturday in the second week of December, Maisie arrived for her morning visit, did 2 hours of bookkeeping, helped Ruth make a potato soup that was better than it had any right to be, and then sat at the kitchen table after lunch with the look on her face that Lenora had come to recognize as the precursor to something she'd been thinking about for a while. "Can I ask you something?" Maisie said. "You always do," Lenora said. Not unkindly. "Do you like my papa?" She said it flat, direct, the way she said things when she'd decided the direct version was more efficient than the careful version. Lenora looked at her for a moment. Yes, she said. I do. As a foreman, as more than that. Maisie sat with this. Something moved across her face. Not surprised she hadn't been asking because she didn't know the answer. More like someone confirming what they already understood. He likes you too, she said. He doesn't say so, but he comes home different on days he's talked with you. She traced a pattern on the kitchen table with one finger. He worked really hard to clear the homestead debt. I know. He worked harder after he started working for you. Like he was trying to get to something. She looked up. Is that something you knew about? That he was trying to get the debt cleared? Lenora thought about the October evening in the study. The hat in his hands. The things he'd said and the one thing he hadn't. I suspected, she said. Maisie nodded, absorbing this. I don't want him to be sad anymore, she said. Not with drama. Just plainly. He's been sad for a long time. Not all the time. But underneath, she looked at Lenora with her mother's patience and her father's directness. You make it less. The kitchen was very quiet. Maisie. I'm not trying to push, she said, with the air of someone who is absolutely trying to be measured about a thing she cares about a great deal. I just wanted you to know. Lenora sat for a moment with the weight of what the girl had just given her. Not a request, not a scheme. Just a child saying, here's something true that I want someone to have. Thank you, she said. Maisie went back to her bookkeeping. Rourke came by late that afternoon to collect her, and Lenora watched them leave from the study window, the girl, on her horse, talking already. The man riding beside her, listening with his particular quality of attention. The two of them moving down the ranch road in the thin winter light. She stood at the window for a while after they disappeared past the tree line. Then she went to her desk and wrote a letter to Aldous Fry and Helena. Not about the legal case. About something else she'd been thinking through for several weeks, a structural arrangement for Silver Briar's ownership and operation that would change how certain decisions were made and what certain roles meant going forward. It was not a simple letter. She wrote 3 drafts before she had something she was willing to send. When she finally sealed it, she sat for a moment in the quiet of the study. Fire needed more wood. She got up and put it in. The last thing before Christmas that mattered happened on a Wednesday, when the snow was 6 inches deep on the ground, and the sky was the white-gray of a territory in deep winter, and Callan Rourke appeared at the main house door at 7 in the morning with his hat in his hands and told Ruth he needed to see Mrs. Ashcombe if she wasn't busy. Lenora was never not busy. She came to the door anyway. He had a piece of paper with him. He held it out. It was a document from the county land office. The homestead debt was cleared. 40 acres of Rourke land, paid in full, registered and recorded. His name at the top. No lien attached. She looked at it. Then at him. I'm not the foreman of Silver Briar, he said. As of this morning, I've given Gibbons my resignation. The cold air came in around them both. Rourke, I've got 40 acres. A sound horse. One good arm that'll be fully right by spring. He held her gaze. And Maisie, who has been telling me for 4 months that I am making this more complicated than it needs to be. Lenora felt something move in her chest. Not surprise exactly. She had, in some part of herself, seen this coming. The letter to Fry, the October conversation, the cleared debt. The shape of where all of it was pointing. But standing in a doorway in December with the cold air and this man holding out a piece of paper that said he had come to her with nothing borrowed and nothing owed. I wanted to come to you with clean ground under my feet, he said. That's all. That's the whole of it. She looked at him. At the hat in his hands. At the paper. At the man who had stepped forward in a mercantile 11 months ago because his daughter had said the right thing, and he had agreed with her, and who had spent 11 months being exactly what he appeared to be. You resigned, she said. Yes, you'll need work. I've got 40 acres. 40 acres won't support 3 people. Something moved in his face. Are you offering me the position back? He said. Very carefully. I'm offering you a partnership, she said. Which is different, and which I wrote to my solicitor about 6 weeks ago, so there's already a framework for it. If you want to read the terms. He stood very still. Partnership, he said, in the breeding operation. Formalized. Equal decision-making on the herd. Revenue sharing after operating costs. She met his eyes. You know more about what those horses are worth than anyone in this territory. Past time, the arrangement reflected that. He looked at her for a long moment. That's the business part, he said. Yes, is there a personal part? She took a breath. There's a personal part. He waited. I would like you to ask me, she said. Properly. When you're ready. I'm not going to make it easy for you by saying it first. Corner of his mouth moved. Almost. You're telling me what to do while refusing to do it yourself. Yes, that's somewhat unreasonable, probably. Put his hat on. Then he reached into his coat pocket and produced a ring. Plain gold, worn smooth, clearly old, he held it in his palm. It was my mother's, he said. I've been carrying it since October, which I realize now is either very confident or very stubborn, and I'm not sure which. Both, she said. Usually with you. He looked at her. Straight, the way he did everything. Lenora Ashcombe, he said. I've got 40 acres, a broken arm that's mostly healed, and a daughter who'll be insufferable about being right. That's what I'm coming to you with. Not the ranch. Not the breeding program, just that. She looked at the ring in his palm. She thought about 11 months. About a list she'd made on a piece of paper the night she should have gone to sleep. About a creek draw in a rainstorm and what he'd said when he was barely conscious enough to say it. About a child at a kitchen table saying, "You make it less." She had been alone for a long time. She had been good at it, which was not the same as preferring it. Yes, she said. He slid the ring onto her finger. It didn't fit perfectly. Her hands were thinner than his mother's had been, but it sat on her hand in the winter light from the open doorway, and she looked at it and felt the realness of it. Maisie's going to say she arranged this, she said. She did arrange some of it, he said. She's 8. I'm not going to give her that. She'll take it anyway. Yes, he said. She will. Behind him, down the road, a horse appeared at the turn in the drive. Maisie sat on it with her coat buttoned wrong and her braid already coming apart, and when she saw them standing in the doorway together, she pulled up her horse and stared. Then she looked at her father's face, then at Lenora's hand, then back at her father. Finally, she said with the patience of someone who has been waiting a very long time for adults to catch up. Maisie said finally, and then immediately pretended she hadn't been waiting for it. That was the part Lenora found most characteristic. The girl sat on her horse in the cold December morning, with her coat buttoned wrong and her braid unraveling, and the expression of someone who has just seen the conclusion of a very long argument she'd been winning the entire time. And then, when both adults looked at her, she arranged her face into something approximating innocence. I just came to see if Ruth needed help with the bread, she said. You don't bake bread, Rourke said. I'm learning. Maisie, she looked at her father, then at Lenora, then at Lenora's hand, where his mother's ring sat slightly loose in the winter light. The innocent expression lasted approximately 3 more seconds. Then she got off her horse. She crossed the yard in the cold, with her boots breaking through the thin crust of snow, and she stopped in front of Lenora. And she looked up with everything. She felt completely visible in her face the relief and the wanting and the trying, not to want too much all tangled up together in the way of children who have learned that wanting things sometimes means losing them. Does this mean she started? Yes, Lenora said. Maisie put her arms around her and held on with the particular desperate strength of someone who has been careful for a very long time and is done being careful. Lenora held her back. Over the girl's shoulder she could see Rourke watching them. He had the look of a man who has been holding something tightly for a long time and is only now beginning to put it down. They stood in the cold, in front of the main house, the 3 of them, until Ruth opened the door and said the draft was getting in, and if people were going to have moments, they could have them inside where it was warm. They came inside. The formal arrangement of things took longer than the emotional one, as it always does. Aldous Fry came from Helena in January to handle the partnership documentation, which was thorough and fair and took 2 full days to get right. Fry asked several careful questions that indicated he was making sure the arrangement was what Lenora actually wanted rather than what someone had pushed her toward. And she answered them with the patience of someone who appreciated that he was asking. Rourke answered his own set of questions without flinching from any of them, including the one about the homestead and whether he intended to incorporate it into Silver Briar's holdings. No, he said, it stays separate. It's Maisie's eventually if she wants it. That's 40 acres that don't belong to the ranch. Fry looked at Lenora. That was his condition, she said. Not mine. I agree with it. Fry wrote it into the partnership agreement. The wedding was in April, when the cottonwoods between Rourke's homestead and Silver Briar's boundary fence had leafed out enough to provide the kind of shade that felt like a reason. Lenora had said she didn't want a church ceremony or a society event, and she meant both. And she held to both despite several people in Copper Hollow attempting to suggest that a wedding of this particular social significance, the wealthiest widow in the territory, and the man who'd been called her foreman, deserved more ceremony. Lenora declined the suggestions with a politeness that got slightly thinner each time someone repeated them. They married on a Wednesday. The witnesses were Gibbons and Ruth and Emmett, who had asked if he could come, and nobody had the heart to say no. Maisie stood between them during the ceremony itself and held both their hands, which had not been planned, and which turned out to be exactly right. The justice of the peace from Copper Hollow performed the ceremony in 11 minutes, which suited everyone present. Afterward, Ruth had made more food than 11 people could reasonably eat, because Ruth expressed strong feeling through excessive cooking, and they ate outside in the April air with the horses visible in the south pasture, and the cottonwoods doing exactly what cottonwoods do in April, which is look like something out of a picture that real life rarely bothers to match. It was not a perfect day. It was too cold for April, and the wind kept taking napkins off the table, and at one point Emmett knocked over a full pitcher of something and spent the next 15 minutes being very apologetic about it. Maisie ate too much and went quiet in the way she went quiet when she was dealing with feelings she hadn't sorted out yet. Lenora found her sitting on the fence rail of the east pasture about an hour into the afternoon, looking at the horses. "You all right?" Lenora said. Maisie was quiet for a moment. "Keep thinking about Mama." Lenora leaned on the fence beside her. "She didn't say anything. She would have liked you," Maisie said. "I think. She liked people who said what they meant." She looked at the horses. "I'm not sad exactly. I just miss her, and I feel..." She stopped. "I feel like I should say that. So it's not a secret." "It shouldn't be a secret," Lenora said. "Not ever." Maisie looked at her. "You won't mind if I talk about her?" "I'll ask you to tell me things about her," Lenora said. "I want to know who she was." The girl held this for a moment. Then something in her settled visibly, the way a person settles when they've been braced for a thing that turns out not to require bracing. "She was stubborn," Maisie said. "Papa says I got it from her, but I think he's just trying to avoid responsibility." Lenora laughed. Actually laughed, the kind that comes without warning. Maisie looked at her with satisfaction. "She had a good laugh too," she said. "I remember that." They stayed at the fence until Rourke came to find them, which took about 10 minutes, because he had the particular radar of a father who can tell when his daughter has gone somewhere to be quietly complicated. He came and leaned on the fence on Maisie's other side, and the three of them stood there with the horses in the April wind, and nobody said anything for a while. Then Maisie looked up at Lenora with the question she'd been holding since December. "Can I ask her now?" she said to her father. Rourke looked at Lenora. "I think that's up to Mrs." He stopped. "That's up to Lenora," he said, getting used to it. Maisie turned to face Lenora fully on the fence rail, which required some balancing, and she steadied herself and looked at her with everything she had. "Would you be my mama?" Not Mrs. Ashcombe, not formally. The real question, the one she'd been circling since that first Saturday morning in the kitchen with the ledger books, the one that had been underneath every visit and every bookkeeping session and every afternoon in the barn. Lenora had known it was coming. She had thought about what she would say, in the careful way she thought about important things. All of that preparation turned out to be irrelevant. "Yes," she said, the same word she'd said in December, and it meant the same thing and more than that. Maisie grabbed her around the middle and held on again, the same way she had in December, except this time it felt less like desperation and more like arrival. Rourke put his hand on his daughter's back. His eyes met Lenora's over the girl's head. She had stopped being able to predict what she saw in his face, and she had come to understand that this was not a problem. Some people you read immediately and completely. Others you spend years learning, and the learning is not a failure to arrive at is the whole point. The legal proceedings against Sterling Voss concluded in June. The conviction covered fraud, conspiracy to commit theft, and the bribery of 2 county officials. His attorney had been skilled, and the case had taken longer than anyone wanted, but the 2 men from the tack room had held to their statements. The Pruitt precedent had been admitted as contextual evidence, and the forged documents had been traced through a handwriting analysis to a man in Voss's employ who had been dismissed from Silver Briar 8 months before the forgeries appeared. Former foreman, the one who had left suddenly. Lenora had suspected him since August. It had taken until April to prove it. Voss was sentenced and taken to the territorial prison in the first week of June. His Crescent Creek property went to his creditors, of whom there were more than anyone had known, because part of what Fry's investigation had uncovered was that Voss had been operating for years at the edge of his actual means, using new acquisitions to service old debts, the entire structure depending on the next land grab to hold up the last one. The Pruitt property, the land he had taken from the man who'd sold under pressure, was returned to Pruitt's family after a separate proceeding that Lenora's solicitor assisted with, at her direction and at Silver Briar's expense. She did not tell anyone she'd done that. Fry knew because he handled the paperwork. Rourke knew because she told him. Ruth knew in the way Ruth knew most things, by being present and attentive without appearing to be. Nobody else needed to know. Copper Hollow, for its part, had fully rehabilitated its opinion of Lenora Ashcombe Rourke by spring, and by summer she was being referred to in certain circles as the most capable rancher in the county, which was a change from the winter before last, when she'd been referred to primarily by reference to her scar and her dead husband's property. She noted the change without particularly trusting it. She had learned, at some cost, that a town's opinion was not a reliable measure of anything except a town's opinion, which shifted with the wind and the most recent available information, and should be treated accordingly. What she trusted was the work, the horses, the breeding program that Rourke had developed through 2 full seasons now into something that buyers came from 3 territories to see. Partnership books that balanced at the end of every month. Not perfectly, there was a drought in the summer that hit the cattle numbers. And 1 bad transaction with a buyer from Cheyenne, who turned out to be less reliable than his reputation, but solidly, built on actual numbers and actual decisions made by 2 people who were honest with each other about what they saw. Rourke was still not easy to work alongside. He was still honest in the way that occasionally felt like sandpaper. He still made decisions before he'd fully communicated them, and then was surprised when she pushed back, and she still worked on problems alone longer than she should before bringing them to him. And they still had arguments in the barn about things that mattered, and reached the right answer through friction rather than agreement. This was not a problem either. She had been married to a careful man who agreed with her on most things, and she had loved him honestly. Khan partnered with a stubborn man who disagreed with her on a regular basis and was usually worth listening to. And the difference was not a downgrade, it was a different kind of thing, suited to who she was now rather than who she had been. Maisie turned 9 in July, and then 10, and then 11, growing in the way of children who have found solid ground, not faster or slower than before, but differently, with a steadiness underneath the growing that hadn't always been there. She continued the bookkeeping. She got good at it, genuinely good, not just competent, and by the time she was 11, she was managing the basic accounts on her own 2 days a week, which Lenora supervised but increasingly did not need to correct. She had her mother's patience and her father's honesty, and her own thing, which was a quality of attention that missed very little and filed everything away in the right place. She talked about her mother regularly. Lenora had meant what she'd said at the fence. She asked questions. She listened to the answers. She kept a photograph of Clara Rourke on the mantelpiece in the main house study. Maisie added to it over time, a small drawing Clara had made that Rourke had kept folded in his coat pocket, a letter in Clara's handwriting that Maisie asked Lenora to read aloud once because she wanted to hear someone else's voice say the words. The dead don't disappear when you love their people. Lenora had learned that from Edmund how to carry someone forward into a life they never lived to see, how to let their absence be part of the shape of things rather than a wound in it. She passed that learning to Maisie in the way things get passed not in a single conversation, but in the accumulation of small ones over years. Lenora and Rourke had 2 more children. A boy they named Thomas, after nobody in particular, just a name they both liked, who arrived in the spring 2 years after the wedding and had his father's quiet and his mother's stubbornness in roughly equal measure, and a girl 3 years after that, named Clara, not to replace, but to honor, because Maisie had asked and Lenora had said yes without hesitating. The house that had felt empty when Lenora arrived in Copper Hollow was not empty anymore. It was, most days, genuinely loud, with Maisie's opinions and Thomas's persistent curiosity about how things worked, and Clara's early talent for expressing her needs at volume. Rourke navigated it the way he navigated most things, by listening, when it required listening, and stepping in when it required stepping in, and being steadily present in the way that mattered most over the long run, which is not any single dramatic moment, but the accumulation of ordinary ones. He still wore the battered hat when he thought Lenora wasn't paying attention. She let him get away with it more often than she admitted. The refuge came out of a specific afternoon in the fall of the 3rd year of the marriage, when a woman appeared at Silver Briar's front gate with 2 children and a single bag, and the look of someone who had been making a decision for a long time and had finally made it. Her name was Vera. Her husband had left her the debt and taken the cattle, and she had nowhere to go and no skills that could quickly become wages. And she had heard, she said, that the widow Ashcombe sometimes helped women in difficult situations, which was not something Lenora had said aloud or established formally, but which apparently had been understood in the territory from certain things she'd done quietly. Took Vera and her children in. She talked to Rourke about it that evening. "It's not a one-time thing," she said. "I think it needs to be a real structure. A place where women can come and learn skills that pay bookkeeping, horse care, ranch management, and stay while they're learning with their children without having to marry someone to survive." Rourke sat with this. "Silver Briar's big enough," he said. "Big enough, but it needs its own building, its own garden, its own accounts, separate from the ranch accounts. That'll cost. I know what it'll cost. I've been running numbers for 6 weeks." She set the paper in front of him. He looked at it. He spent a long time looking at it, in the way he looked at things that were going to require him to have an opinion. "This comes out of the ranch operating budget in the first 2 years," he said. "Yes. And after that, it's self-sustaining if the bookkeeping operation and the horse care fees come in at the projected rate. Conservatively, yes. If I'm wrong on the conservative estimate, it takes an extra year." He looked at the numbers for another moment. "Do it," he said. "That's it? Just do it." He looked at her. "You've been thinking about it for 6 weeks. You've got the numbers. What do you need from me? I thought you'd want to argue about it. I might have argued about it 6 weeks ago. Something that was almost a smile. You had 6 weeks to get it right. I'm not going to argue with 6 weeks of thinking." She looked at him. "You're occasionally a very reasonable man," she said. "Don't spread it around. I've got a reputation." She built it. It took the better part of 2 years to build it properly, the structure, the accounts, the arrangement with the county for legal assistance when women needed it, the relationship with the doctor in Copper Hollow, who agreed to see the refuge's residents at a reduced rate. Vera was the first. There were 3 more in the first year, and 6 the second, and by the 3rd year, there was a waiting arrangement and a small school for the children in the building beside the main residence. Women came. They learned the books, the horses, the managing of property and accounts, and the particular confidence that comes from discovering you can do things you were told you couldn't. Some stayed in the territory. Some moved on. A few found work at Silver Briar itself, because by then the ranch was large enough that Lenora had more management needs than one partnership could cover. Copper Hollow's opinion of Lenora Ashcombe Rourke continued to evolve in ways that she continued to receive politely and not lean on. She had stopped needing the town's approval sometime around the 1st year of the marriage, and the losing of that need had been one of the quieter pieces of becoming who she was now. One evening in October 6 years after she'd first driven into Copper Hollow in a hired carriage with the rain on the window and the scar on her cheek and the ledger satchel under her arm, Lenora sat at the study desk going through the breeding records for the upcoming season. The house was quiet in the way houses are quiet when everyone in them is occupied rather than absent. Maisie was at the kitchen table doing something mathematical with focused intensity. Thomas was asleep, had been since 7, Clara was almost asleep, or pretending to be, which was close enough. Rourke came in from outside with cold air on his coat and sat across from her with the Daily Ledger, and they worked in the particular silence of two people who have spent enough time in the same room that silence is a form of communication. After a while he said, without looking up, "There's a buyer coming from up near Billings next week. I want to show him the 2-year-old geldings before I show him the mares." "The geldings first makes the mares look better by comparison," she said. "That's the idea. When did you get strategic?" "I've always been strategic. I just don't announce it." She looked at him over the papers. He was reading the ledger with his reading expression, which was the same as his regular expression, except the line between his brows was slightly deeper. He was 44 now. He had a few gray hairs at his temples that Maisie had pointed out with the thoroughness of a child who finds physical evidence of her parents' aging genuinely interesting. His hands still had the look of someone who had been outdoors in every weather, and probably always would. She had stopped thinking about the scar on her own face years ago. Not because it had faded, it hadn't, particularly, but because at some point it had simply stopped being the most important thing in the room she was in. Couldn't identify the exact day that it happened. It had been gradual, the way most real changes are, until she'd looked in a mirror one morning and realized she'd stopped looking at it first. Lenora. She looked up. He was watching her now instead of the ledger. "Where'd you go?" he said. "Thinking," she said. "About?" Considered the actual answer, which was complicated, and gave him a piece of it. "When I came here, what I expected." He waited. "I expected to figure out what to do with a ranch I inherited, and then make a decision about whether to keep it." She looked at the window, where the October dark had settled completely. "I did not expect any of the rest of it being you, Maisie, Thomas, Clara, the refuge." She looked at him. "A family." He held her gaze. "Was that bad? Not expecting it?" She thought about it honestly. "The not expecting was hard," she said. "The having is not." He nodded slowly. From the kitchen, Maisie's voice, "I can hear you two being sentimental in there." "It's loud." Rourke looked at the ceiling. "She gets that from you," Lenora said. "She absolutely does not. The commentary on other people's emotional states. That's you." He opened his mouth to argue, then closed it. "Then I don't do that. You do it constantly. You're just quiet about it." Pause. "She gets it from both of us," he said. "That's fair," Lenora agreed. Maisie appeared in the doorway in her socks. Because she had given up wearing shoes inside the house sometime around age 10, and nobody had successfully argued her back into them. She looked between her parents, with the expression she'd been wearing since she was 8, the one that contained everything she thought about any situation, and revealed approximately half of it. "I finished the accounts," she said. "Let me see," Lenora said. Maisie brought them. They were right. They were better than right, they were clean, with a note in the margin where she'd caught an error from 2 weeks prior, and corrected it without being asked. "Good," Lenora said. Maisie took the ledger back. "I'm going to bed." "You should have gone an hour ago," Rourke said. "I know." She kissed him on the cheek, matter of fact, the way she'd been doing since she was old enough to reach. Then she looked at Lenora, and the look was different, older than it used to be. More complicated, the look of a girl who has been paying attention for years and has accumulated something. "You know what I think about sometimes?" she said. "What?" Lenora said. "That day in the mercantile, when I yelled at that man." She leaned against the doorframe. "I was so angry, I didn't even know you. I just knew it was wrong." A pause. "And then you shook my hand, like I was a real person who'd done something real." She was quiet for a moment. "I think that was when I decided I wanted you to stay." The study was very still. Lenora looked at this girl who was almost a young woman, who had her father's directness and her mother's warmth and her own particular fierce quality of attention, who had walked into the middle of a room full of adults at 8 years old and decided that cruelty was worth fighting regardless of the cost, who had then, with the complete stubbornness of a child who knows what she wants, spent months engineering the situation until it came out the way she thought it should. "You were 8 years old," Lenora said. "I knew what I wanted," Maisie said. "Simply. I usually do." She went to bed. Rourke and Lenora sat in the study in the quiet after she left. "She did arrange most of it," Rourke said. "Eventually." "I know. She's going to be completely impossible when she's grown." She's already completely impossible, Lenora said. She's also the best person I know who's under 30. He thought about that. Yeah, he said, she is. They went back to the ledgers. Here is what Lenora understood, by the time October came in the 6th year, that the people who tell you what you're worth are rarely the right people to ask. That a town's opinion is whether it comes and goes, and it will change again tomorrow, and you should dress for it, but not mistake it for something more permanent. That the scar on her face had never been the most important thing in any room she'd walked into, even in the years when it felt that way, because the most important thing in any room is always who is willing to stand up in it. She understood that love doesn't arrive as an event. It arrives as a series of ordinary things, a direct answer to a difficult question, a list made at midnight when sleep won't come, a man who walks out into a storm because he can't leave horses to it, a girl who sits at a kitchen table learning bookkeeping because she wants to be near someone. She understood that she had built something. She had not built it alone, and she had not built it without cost. And it had not come out clean or easy or the way she'd planned when she arrived in a hired carriage with a satchel of ledgers and a practiced defense against the way people looked at her face. She had built it the only way real things get built badly at first, then better, then piece by piece until what was standing was strong enough to last. And on Maisie's wedding morning, 15 years later, when the girl was 23, and the man waiting outside was someone she had chosen with the same decisive certainty she'd always brought to everything, Lenora stood behind her in the bedroom of the main house and fastened the buttons of her dress, while the April light came through the window the same way it had on a certain April day years before. Maisie looked at her in the mirror. "Do you remember the first day I came to Silver Briar?" she said. "On that horse that was too big for me? I remember telling myself it was only slightly terrifying," Lenora said. Maisie smiled. "I was completely terrified, too. I'd never wanted something so much, and I didn't know if you'd let me stay. Came back the next Saturday, anyway. I usually do what I've decided to do," Maisie said. "You know that by now." Lenora fastened the last button. In the mirror, she could see both their faces, Maisie's 23-year-old face, clear and ready, and her own face, 50 now, the scar still there, the way it had always been there, neither faded nor defining, just part of the face of a woman who had been through the years that make a person into who they actually are. She looked at herself in the mirror and felt, simply and without any drama at all, like herself. Not the widow, not the wealthy one, not the scarred one, not the one no one wanted to love, just herself. "Best thing I ever talked him into," Maisie said. Quietly, Lenora put her hands on the girl's shoulders. "Go marry your man," she said. Maisie turned and hugged her and then went. Outside, Rourke was waiting beside the horses. He had worn a good coat, but had put on the battered hat anyway, in the way he always did when he thought she wouldn't notice, and she noticed every time, and had long since decided it was not worth the argument. He looked up when she came out. She raised an eyebrow at the hat. "It's a good hat," he said. "It's a terrible hat." Maisie doesn't mind it. Maisie's getting married today. "She's not paying attention to your hat." He smiled at her. "The real one, the one that took years to see regularly and was worth every one of them." She stood beside him in the April morning, with the cottonwoods in new leaf, and the horses moving in the south pasture, and the sound of their children somewhere behind them in the house. Thomas is arguing with Clara about something, the ordinary music of a house that is full. Lenora Ashcombe Rourke had arrived at the Copper Hollow with 10,000 acres and more money than she needed, and a face that people decided told them everything about her worth. What she had now could not be counted in acres. It had started with a child who stepped forward in a room full of adults and decided that a stranger was worth defending. It had grown into something that had its own weight, its own history, its own permanent shape. You cannot inherit love. You cannot purchase it, or command it, or produce it by being wealthy or deserving, or even by wanting it very much. It arrives on its own schedule, through its own doors, and it looks most often not like what you expected, but like what you actually needed, which is a different thing entirely. Lenora had expected nothing from Copper Hollow except a set of ledgers and a decision to make. She had gotten instead the whole of her life. The horses moved in the south pasture. The April light came through the cottonwoods at the angle it always did this time of year. Somewhere inside the house, Clara laughed at something Thomas had said, or said to him, and the sound came out through the windows and across the yard. Rourke stood beside her, and she stood beside him, and neither of them needed to say anything. They had gotten good at that, over the years. At the not needing to say what both of them already knew. Maisie's wedding was over by noon. The guests ate Ruth's food and drank the cider that Thomas had taken personal responsibility for producing in quantities that suggested he'd underestimated attendance. And the afternoon moved through itself the way good afternoons do, without anyone forcing it. By evening, when the last of the guests had gone, and Maisie had left with her husband in the direction of their own life, the main house settled into the particular quiet of a place that has held a lot of people and is now returning to itself. Ruth washed dishes. Thomas fell asleep in a chair before 8 o'clock, which he denied afterward. Clara sat on the porch steps with a piece of wedding cake and watched the stars come out one at a time the way they do over Montana in April, slow and deliberate, as if each one is making sure of its position before committing. Lenora and Rourke sat on the porch beside her. Nobody talked much. The day had used up its words. After a while, Clara leaned against Lenora's arm the way she'd done since she was small, and Lenora put her arm around her without thinking about it. The way you do things that have been true for long enough that the body knows them before the mind does. Rourke reached over and took Lenora's free hand. His hands were still the hands of a man who worked outdoors in every weather. Hers had gotten that way too, over the years. The ring his mother had given her sat where it had always sat, worn smooth in the same places now, shaped to her. "Good day," he said. Not a question. "Good day," she agreed. Clara looked up at the stars. "Is Maisie coming back on Sunday?" she asked. "She'll be back when she's back," Rourke said. "That's not an answer. It's the only one I've got." Clara considered this, and apparently found it acceptable, because she went back to her stars. The night was cold and clear, and full of the kind of silence that isn't empty the horses breathing in the south pasture, the creek moving somewhere below the property line, the sound of a world that is simply, quietly, continuing. Lenora looked at it all. She thought, this is it. This is the thing. Not the land or the money or the victory over Voss or the refuge or any single event that could be pointed to and named. Just this, a porch in April, a husband's hand, a daughter half asleep against her arm, another daughter somewhere starting her own life with the same stubborn certainty she'd had at 8 years old. This was the fortune that didn't appear in any ledger she had ever kept. And it was, by every measure that actually counted, the most valuable thing she had ever owned.